Elvis Presley, the Midnight Secret. There's a story that's been whispered about for years, one that supposedly reveals a side of Elvis Presley the world never saw. Jerry Schilling, one of Elvis's closest friends, allegedly kept a secret for 4 decades. Reports claim that every single night, Elvis's car would leave Graceland at exactly midnight, traveling precisely 23 miles before returning. Elvis would come back alone, his eyes red, looking like he'd been crying. Now, rumors suggest Jerry finally revealed where the king went during those mysterious drives, and if true, it changes everything we thought we knew about him. The story supposedly begins in the summer of 1972. Jerry was staying at Graceland, helping Elvis prepare for upcoming tours. The Memphis heat made sleeping nearly impossible, and around midnight, Jerry got up for water. As he passed a window overlooking the driveway, he allegedly saw Elvis's black Cadillac pulling through the gates. Elvis was alone, driving himself, which people say was highly unusual. The king rarely went anywhere without security. At first, Jerry supposedly didn't think much of it. Maybe Elvis couldn't sleep. Maybe he needed to clear his head. But the next night, at exactly the same time, Jerry heard the Cadillac's engine starting again. He looked out the window. There was Elvis, alone, disappearing into the darkness. This time, Jerry checked his watch. Midnight. Exactly midnight. By the 4th night, curiosity allegedly turned to concern. Jerry started asking around carefully, not wanting to invade Elvis's privacy but needing to understand what was happening. Red West, one of Elvis's longtime bodyguards, supposedly gave Jerry a knowing look and said they all knew about the drives. They'd been happening for years. But Red warned him not to ask Elvis about it. He didn't want to talk about it. Stories claim that even Priscilla knew Elvis went somewhere but told the security team to let him be. She supposedly said he needed this, whatever it was. Elvis's driver didn't know the destination either because Elvis always insisted on driving himself during these midnight trips. The mystery consumed Jerry for weeks. Every night, like clockwork, Elvis would allegedly slip out at midnight and return around 2:30 in the morning. His eyes were always red when he came back, but not from substances. It looked like he'd been crying. One night, according to the story, Jerry made a decision that would change everything. He waited until he heard Elvis's car start, then quickly got into his own rental and followed at a safe distance. He felt guilty, like he was betraying Elvis's trust, but something told him this was important. Elvis allegedly drove south through Memphis, passing through wealthy neighborhoods, then middle-class areas, and finally into poorer sections of the city. The streets got narrower, the houses more worn down. Reports suggest Elvis pulled up in front of a small, modest house in a neighborhood that clearly struggled with poverty. The house was tiny with peeling paint, but the porch light was on as if expecting someone. Jerry supposedly parked a block away and watched. Elvis sat in his car for a few moments, then got out carrying what looked like grocery bags. He didn't go to the front door. Instead, he walked around to the back of the house and let himself in like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Jerry allegedly waited in his car, heart pounding, not knowing what to think. Was Elvis having an affair? Nothing made sense. 2 hours passed. Jerry almost fell asleep when the back door opened and Elvis emerged. Even from a distance, Jerry could supposedly see Elvis wiping his eyes. The king of rock and roll, the man who commanded stages in front of thousands, was crying in the backyard of this little house. The next morning, the story goes, Jerry couldn't hold it in any longer. He found Elvis alone by the pool and confessed he'd followed him. Elvis's head supposedly snapped up, anger flashing in his eyes. His voice was sharp, dangerous. Jerry had rarely heard Elvis use that tone with him. But then something shifted in Elvis's expression. The anger melted into exhaustion, and Elvis sat back down heavily, putting his face in his hands. After a long silence, Elvis allegedly began to speak. He mentioned his mother, Gladys. Everyone knew Elvis had been devastated by her death in 1958, but few people understood just how deeply that loss had affected him. According to the story, before she died, Gladys made Elvis promise something. She was in the hospital and knew she wasn't coming home. She supposedly held his hand and said he was going to be rich, more rich than anyone from East Tupelo had a right to be, but he shouldn't forget where he came from. Elvis's voice allegedly cracked as he continued. His mother told him there would always be people struggling just like they did. She made him promise he'd help them, but she said to do it quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no making a show of it. That wasn't charity, she said. That was just being human. The house Jerry saw him at supposedly belonged to a woman named Mrs. Estelle Washington. She was 78 years old, living alone, and before Elvis found her, she was skipping meals to pay her electric bill. Reports claim Elvis met her at a church charity drive in 1965. He saw her in the corner, and she reminded him so much of his mother. Same kind eyes, same way of holding herself up even when everything was falling apart. He slipped her some money that day, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. So he went back. No cameras, no security, just him. And he found out she wasn't the only one. The story suggests there were others. A Korean War veteran with no family. An elderly couple where the wife had dementia and the husband was too proud to ask for help. A woman raising her grandson alone after her daughter passed. The list went on. Elvis allegedly visited them on different nights, bringing groceries, paying bills, sometimes just sitting and talking. They supposedly didn't know he was Elvis Presley. To them, he was just some nice young man who helped out, a volunteer from a church, someone who cared. According to Jerry, Elvis was adamant about keeping it secret. If he made it public, what would happen? Cameras would show up at these people's doors. Every person in Memphis with a sad story would come calling. And worse, these people would lose their dignity. They'd become charity cases in the newspaper. This way, Elvis could keep his promise to his mother. He could help people who needed it, and they got to keep their pride because they didn't know they were being helped by Elvis Presley. Jerry supposedly learned that night that Elvis had been making these midnight drives since the mid-1960s. Over the years, some of the people he helped had passed away, and Elvis always sent anonymous donations for funeral expenses. He allegedly kept a small notebook in his car with names, addresses, and specific needs. Reminders about medications, electric bills, and daily routines. In 1975, something happened that supposedly shook Elvis to his core. Mrs. Washington passed away from a heart attack. Jerry found him sitting in his bedroom at Graceland, staring at nothing. Tears streamed down his face. According to the story, Elvis said he never even told her his real name. 7 years he knew her, and she died thinking he was just some guy who brought her groceries. Elvis couldn't attend her funeral because the risk of being recognized was too great. But he allegedly sent a massive anonymous donation to cover all expenses. Someone who attended supposedly reported seeing a man in sunglasses and a hat standing at the back of the church, leaving before anyone could approach him. As Elvis's health deteriorated in 1976 and 1977, the midnight drives became more difficult. His doctors told him to stop driving, especially at night. But stories suggest Elvis couldn't break the promise he'd made to his mother. The security team started quietly following him at a distance just to make sure he was safe, though Elvis never knew. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, Jerry and Red West were supposedly among those who went through his personal belongings at Graceland. In the glove compartment of his Cadillac, they allegedly found the notebook. 13 names. 13 addresses. Next to each name were detailed notes about their needs, their routines, their struggles. Jerry and Red made a decision that day. They would visit each address and make sure these people knew that someone still cared. What they discovered supposedly shocked them. None of the people knew they'd been helped by Elvis Presley. To one woman, he was Michael, that nice man from the church. To a veteran, he was John, my buddy who checks on me. To another woman, he was simply Tommy, my guardian angel. One woman allegedly figured it out when Jerry and Red came to her door. She said she'd heard his voice on the radio one night while he was in her kitchen and recognized it immediately. But she never said anything because she knew he didn't want her to. It wasn't about who he was. It was about what he did. After Vernon Presley died in 1979, stories claim the full financial records came to light. Between 1960 and 1977, there were supposedly over $847,000 in unexplained cash withdrawals marked simply as personal expenses. The family allegedly chose to keep this information private, respecting Elvis's wish for anonymity in his giving. For 40 years, Jerry supposedly kept this secret. But when one of the women Elvis helped passed away in 2012, she allegedly left a note in her will specifically giving permission for the story to be told. She wrote that the world thinks Elvis was a king because of his music, but she knew him as a man who kept a promise to his mama. That was the real reason he deserved to be remembered. In 2015, rumors suggest Jerry finally agreed to tell the story. After it allegedly aired, something remarkable happened. Other people came forward with similar stories. A woman in Las Vegas said a kind man had paid her mother's rent for 2 years. A man in Atlanta remembered someone who had helped his grandfather. The stories kept coming, each one adding another layer to the legend. Jerry Schilling, now in his 80s, supposedly reflects on those midnight drives with a mixture of sadness and pride. Everyone remembers Elvis as the king, but on those midnight drives, he wasn't a king. He was a son keeping a promise to his mother. And maybe that's what he'd want to be remembered for most. Not the crown, but his word. The Cadillac Elvis allegedly drove on those midnight trips is now supposedly displayed at Graceland. If the story is true, visitors walk past it every day, never knowing they're looking at evidence of one of the greatest secrets in rock and roll history. The secret of a king who spent his midnights being simply human, one grocery bag and one unpaid bill at a time. Elvis Presley died at 42 years old. But the promise he supposedly made to Gladys Presley lived on. And in the end, maybe that's the real measure of a life well lived. Not the number of records sold or stages conquered, but the quiet acts of kindness done when nobody was watching. When there were no cameras, no applause, just a son keeping his word to his mother.